Good afternoon and welcome to another session of the Council. My guest today is a very interesting gentleman, somebody who I met very recently but has such a deep understanding of how sports and its ecosystem functions in India. Mr. Deep Mukherjee, welcome to the show.
Thank you.
For the benefit of our viewers and our listeners, could you please give us a window into your career thus far?
Well, I am part of the sports business at Star for the last 7 years now, and been fortunate to be part of the founding team for Star Sports. In fact, we launched it under, as part of the core team which launched Star Sports in the country, which has been a very fascinating experience and great learning experience as well. For the last 2 years, I have been driving an initiative on youth sports along with CII. Trying to drive the cause of grassroots sports development with specific focus on two areas, on education and investments. We'll talk about it as we move ahead. Prior to Star, I was part of the HR services industry for a good 10 years, and again been very fortunate to be part of the founding team of a company called Team Lease, which was I think India's first organized staffing services company. Which had a very great IPO run in a few years back. I started my career in the IT segment, IT sector, with a company called NIIT, where I spent close to 6 years traveling across the country, driving businesses on IT services, managing channel networks and institutional sales. Right. So that's been my career graph, if that answers your question.
Should I make the assumption that now that you're in sports, it's probably your bias lies there in terms of the industry that you like the most?
Well, yes, you can say that for simple reason that sports is something which is very close to all our hearts. At the end of the day, most of us are passionate about sports. And I consider myself really fortunate because it's probably the first time you're able to drive a business which you're close to, passionate about. And I also had the good fortune of working with some of the heroes who have grown up watching, people like Kapil Dev or Wasim Akram, Rahul Dravid, Saurabh Ganguly. It was a great experience working with them. It was a great experience learning from them and actually see what makes great men and women, sports right. people. And I personally believe that the sports industry is going through a massive growth in the last few years. I think in the next few years, it will be one of the few high growth sectors in the country. Right. So yes, it is very close to my heart and my passion as of now.
Right. So picking up on what you just said, which is it's going to be a high growth sector in a few years, I want to ask you a question that we ask all our guests, which is, Deep, do you think India is a nation of sport?
Well, I would certainly believe so. I think I fundamentally believe that sports is all about nation building. Sports is all about a passion for a team or for an individual who's playing that. It's a national integration driven approach in that sense of the word. I think if you go back, as a country, we have always been passionate about few sports which we have been doing well in, have been driving very effectively, whether it's hockey in the past, cricket in the recent times, badminton in the very recent times, Right. But I think one fundamental change which I am seeing in the country in the last almost decade now is that India is becoming a multiple sports country. Correct. Our image of a single sport loving nation is undergoing a massive change, which is very good for us. Today, the popularity of a football and a badminton and a table tennis and a kabaddi and a wrestling is as high. The element of participation of consumption by people, children, is extremely high across all sports. So I think it would be very fair to say that India is a sport-loving nation. India is a nation which is very passionate about the sport it follows. And in the recent time, there are enough and more data points which substantiate what we say now. Right. So yes, India is a very strong nation of sports.
Right, and I agree on a lot of points where you say there is this unprecedented growth that we are seeing across across sporting growth, right? Whether it is the sheer number of leagues that have started, whether it is the sheer number of stars that are now being born, right? But one thing that I've always wondered, and this is where this is the purpose of this conversation, trying to understand the private sector's role in developing sport in India, right? Now, unfortunately, when you say private sector's involvement, a lot of people think private sector as this big spending money, the stuff on the glamour, stuff of, you put brands on the IPL jersey, so on and so forth. But there's this whole ecosystem behind it, whether it is even investing in grassroots for that matter. So, because you're very close to a lot of people who have invested heavily in sport in India and largely from the private sector, what are two factors most private sector companies look for when they invest or when they decide they want to invest in sport?
I think firstly, let me address the point you raised about the private sector being involved in sport.
Right.
If you go back 30 years, the IT revolution in this country was on the back of private sector.
Right.
Private enterprise drove the IT growth in this country. Society took it up, and there was enough and more IT organizations which created that need and demand for IT. If you go back to the telecom sector, something similar also happened there, whereby the telecom sector growth on the back of private enterprise. And I see no reason why sports sector should be run differently. I think for sports industry and a culture to grow in the country, you need to have private sector participation therein. Sports, to my mind, is really a bottoms-up approach. But unfortunately, in Indian context, it's been top-down. There are a few leagues which have become very popular, sorry, and very popular, and it percolates from there. Right. But I think if you need to have the growth of sports and from an ecosystem point of view, you need to have a grassroots movement. You need to have a school sports movement. You need to have a university sports movement, a youth sports movement, so on and so forth. And I think while the government has been very active on the same, the Khelo India Youth Games is a great initiative in that direction. And I keep saying this, for the last 2 seasons I have been involved personally. I see a tremendous amount of energy and verve and excitement when I go to the stadiums, whether it was in Balewadi last month in Pune or earlier. But till the time the ecosystem on sports gets developed in the country by participation of the private enterprise for a business opportunity, I think sports will sputter in its growth. So private sectors have a huge role to play. And I think the entire approach should be to create mechanisms for society to come together and play sport for the fun of playing. There are two models to sport always. One, to chase excellence, where you win medals in the Olympics, where you create heroes. And second is for the fun of playing. And I fundamentally believe if the latter is not happening, the former will never happen. If people do not play sport as a cultural participation, as a societal participation, right, you will never have the medals coming in the country. And I think that's a fundamental shift which we envisage will happen in this country. Private sector will have to take on the mantle for development of sports, whether it's through CSR investments, whether the corporate investments, branding, marketing initiatives. And I think the society will have to start coming together on sports, just the way society comes together for things like films in this country. Right. I think that's the kind of equivalent culture we need to develop in sports. And private sectors have a massive role to play on that.
Right. And I agree with you. I think, and as a matter of fact, sport is also one of the great unifiers, right? I mean, of course, right, for now, it is largely restricted to our biggest cricket matches, for instance. And when India plays the World Cup, for instance, India is playing Australia in a few weeks. The entire country rallies behind them. Recently, that's happening with football, for instance, when India made the AFC Cup. So that is happening. I want to kind of bring forward one of the criticisms that we hear. When I say we, both of us are part of the sports fraternity. People from outside the sports fraternity always question, why should private sector invest in something like sport when there are so many more important avenues to be investing in, whether it's education, women's empowerment, water. So there are so many other more important issues to be investing in. Why should the private sector invest in sport?
Good question. And I think if you go back to the drawing board on various industries, very sectoral growth in this country, you'll possibly find that sports is possibly the only sector which cuts across multiple sectors therein. It cuts across tourism, education, healthcare, among other things which you talked about. Right. I think it's important to understand that sports is part of the education growth for a child. The way a child should learn English, Hindi, physics, maths, he or she also should learn sports. Unfortunately, sports has been seen as a ticket to a fast growth in the society, or a ticket to quick riches in the society.
Right.
Not everybody will go on to become Virat Kohli or Saina Nehwal in this country, but there are people who need to play sports because children should play sports. Right. As parents, as civil society, we need to propagate the cause of sports in the student's life, in child's life, through all the formative years. There are enough and more empirical data points which substantiate that if a child plays sports, there is a tremendous growth in leadership skills, cognitive behavior, fundamental life lessons, among other things. But there is a huge amount of impact on the academic growth as well. So, the entire context of sports lying outside the domain of education is no longer true. Right. It's actually within the education domain. So, if that be the case, I see no reason why sports should be seen in isolation of education. To my mind, it is as much a part of the education system as anything else is. Right. And that's why private sector should get involved. Right. It's doing good for the society, is doing good for your business. And I think those are two things should run parallelly. We did a study last year in terms of what is the impact sports has on a growth of a child. And there was this gentleman who was a medical practitioner. He was sharing a data point which said that when a child is running with the ball, hypothetically speaking, a child running with the ball to score a goal, his cognitive senses are as high when he's doing a very complex mathematical problem. Right. And I think that's saying a lot of things. I think the concept that a sport, playing of a sport, goes on to really improve learning outcomes in schools, apart from keeping a child in school, itself is a good enough reason for organizations and government to support sports as a faculty. Right. And that's really the kind of context which is coming into the country today over a period of time.
Right. It's interesting you mentioned that, because that's I used to play basketball, and you can this can be applied to any sport. As a matter of fact, when for example, when Virat Kohli is taking the crease and the ball's coming at a particular pace, he's already doing mathematical calculations. It just is not conventional mathematical calculations, but he's already he's doing physics, and he's working out a whole bunch of aspects, right? I want to pick up on something you mentioned earlier, which is some of India's biggest revolutions in terms of business have been built on the backs of private sector, right? One thing that has always struck me is the concept of build, operate and transfer, which has been fairly successful with toll roads and airports, two examples that stand out. Do you think that's a model that can be successfully adopted within sport?
See, I think we need to define the infrastructure development in sport now. I think time has come when we need to start looking at sports infrastructure in different manner than it has been conventionally been looked at. Okay. Our understanding of sports infrastructure has been traditionally make huge stadiums, which are massive investments, and which do not have a large usage post the event completion of the event. Right. Typically, what we have seen. I think that's a paradigm which has undergone a slight amount of change, but lots needs to be done over there. If we look at from a perspective of creating mini infrastructures in tier 2, tier 3 locations, or using schools as the hub of all our experiments, then the model really can be implemented, the build, operate, transfer. Right. If you look at the model of Trans Stadia in Ahmedabad, it's a great model which is a multi-purpose stadium without the investments which we normally associate sports stadiums to be built with. Right. It is a facility which can be converted into a convention hall, it can be into a school, it can be converted into a stadium, it can be multi-sport stadium, it can be various things which a society needs to come together on. Right. And I think that's the model for sports to move towards. Right. Traditionally, sports has been seen as an investment domain by the government.
Yes.
Unfortunately, that's not the right approach. Till the time, and I think you said it in a question, till the time the private enterprise gets involved in driving the narrative on sport, the growth of sports will not be commensurate to what it needs to have. Right. the investment on sports will have to move from the large investment which you traditionally seen to a smaller ones, which have multi-purpose outcome and implements the benefit of the children or the society in general in the locations. And if that be the model, then I think the BOT model which talked about definitely apply. In today's context, the investment in sports either done by government or by enterprises who are looking at sports as a growth area because of their own passion or because of the excellence which they are looking at chasing in specific sports. That has to undergo a change in the due course of time. Right. Once that happens, I think we'll see the models evolving.
Right, and I agree with you, and that was where my conflict lie, because it's either been government or it's been private. There's very few, almost no collaborations that have happened, which brings me to my next question, which is one of the reasons why we first met. Making India play, something that's close to your heart. It's a movement. People say it's a project, it's a program. I think it's a movement, especially after I met you and you gave me context as to what it is, which is trying to bridge that gap between what the government and what the country and what the nation needs, as opposed to what private sector can then get involved in, right? So tell us more about the Making India Play initiative through CII.
Well, this initiative was born with the simple point agenda of making 300 million children play 60 minutes daily. Okay, that's the population size of children in this country who are in the school going age really. And 60 minutes is something which the World Health Organization mandates as a norm for children to play in a day. And we felt it was a nice narrative to get the movement happen in the country on sports. And as I said earlier, our agenda was to make people play for the fun of playing, without any outcome attached with it. The child should play sports because it's a good thing for him or her to play sport. We were not chasing medals, we were not chasing excellence out there. And when we went to the drawing board, two things emerged. One, how do you make sports a part of the formal educational curriculum so that it becomes an inclusive approach? Because even today in schools, some children play, most children don't. Children who have an interest or are good in sports stay back and do a coaching class beyond school timing. But most kids in the school, a sports period is a free period. You are free to do anything. Right. And that's something we wanted to change. We wanted to make it a formal curriculum with the same amount of rigor there, which a child undergoes learning any other subject. And that's been our narrative and discussions on policy change with the government, where we said holistic education is possible only when sports is an integral part of the curriculum. And I am happy to say that there have been some shoots over there in the last few months, whereby sports has moved up from the extracurricular activity, which it is called, to a activity now. Right. CBSE, Central Board of Secondary Education, mandated, and I think it's a great movement at their end, mandated 1 P period a day for all classes from 9th to 12th as a circular. And it's not only a mandate, it's not only circular, it's actually a mandate where schools are supposed to report back on what's been their initiative on that. So there's been a tangible movement in that direction by the government. Right. So that's one area we are very particular about, where Making India Play is about making children play in schools through a formal narrative. And we have been driving the case through the ministry, the state governments, through the federations, the Ministry of Sports, etc., etc. A lot has to happen in that space. The second part of the agenda was, how do we get more money into the business of sports? Because till the time business supports an activity, the activity never grows. And we've seen it in telecom, we've seen it in IT, we've seen it in education per se. And we fundamentally believe this, till the time the private sector aligns together for driving a business opportunity on sports, or for a initiative on sports, it will not have the mass impact which it's supposed to have. And we felt that the CSR, the Corporate Social Responsibility Act now, which has been modified by the government to include sports, is a great vehicle in that to drive that conversations there. So we have been driving that conversation with corporate to say, can CSR investments on various areas can also include sports? The good part is sports can piggy ride on education, it can piggy ride on healthcare, it can piggy ride on sanitation. All of it is something which sports can support. And we have been seeing positive movements and developments in that direction by the corporate. So that's the second part. The third part is The reason IT industry grew rapidly is because there was a huge need and opportunity, but also there was a body which was driving the cause of IT industry in this country. NASSCOM played a massive role in growth of IT exports from India. And today, if India is known in the outside world, IT has a very strong role to play. So we felt that the need for a sports body which will drive the cause of sports as an industry in this country. And these are three broad areas which we cherry pick to drive our agenda on making India play. So making India play is essentially about making children play, 300 million children playing 60 minutes daily, making investment opportunities through corporate investments, CSR investments come alive in this country, and drive the business of sports through industry participation. Right. These are three broad areas which making India play is driving towards.
Right. Just off the top of it, thank you for that initiative. I mean, on behalf of everybody in the sports fraternity, I think that is essentially what I think will drive the next batch of champions. To be honest, and it is like you mentioned earlier that grassroots is just as important as investing in the big leagues, for instance. I want to pick up on something on one of the points, which is the CSR spending, right? As you mentioned, very recently the government moved to make CSR investing in sport. You can bring investment of sport under CSR. Why do you think, assuming that had not happened, do you feel that CSR spending in sport could improve in India, and why has it not been a priority for private sector thus far?
So I'll give you some statistics. I think the total CSR spend in the country last year was about 12,000 crores. The investment on sports was 0.01%. And frankly, I'm not surprised with that. For two reasons, as you rightly said in the beginning, there are a lot of other important agendas chasing our country. Why should I put my money on sports? And I think that's been the narrative and the thought at corporate end, maybe rightfully so, all this while. But for a moment, if you change the equation from an indulgence, which is how sports has really been looked at in the conventional sense of the word for a long time, to an imperative for growth of your child, for behavioral growth of your child, cognitive development, academic growth, I think the entire perspective changes. And I think that's one area we are looking at bringing about a change on, where sport should be part of the education spend or education investment in the country, not really a sport per se. That's one aspect of it. Second aspect of it, sports always has been looked at as an outcome. How many medals did you win in the Olympics? Yes. What kind of champions have you produced? So on and so forth. And I think we need to change the focus from outcome to an input. Okay. I think that's very fundamentally are going wrong. Yeah. Because if it's an outcome can happen only if the right input and the efficiencies are built in, and which is what this initiative is all about. This initiative is about getting the base of the pyramid expanding. How do we get 300 million children come together in the business of sports or in the or participate in sports? And when that happens, naturally there will be people who will have a high propensity for performance, excellence, and then the cycle moves on. In today's context, the CSR spend on sports has been focused on excellence, maybe rightfully so again from that perspective, because if there's no outcome, then what are you measuring? Yeah. So we're trying to change the rules of the game a little bit by saying, can we start measuring impact of the spend on CSR on sports education than really only the medals? Right. Medals matter, but I think improving the base matters as well, which is what we're trying to build about. Second is, for a moment, let's shift the focus from CSR to opportunity for investment by corporates. We did a study last year as a pilot study in Maharashtra and trying to understand what are the local sporting events which happen at block level, district level, taluka level in the country. It mapped the various sporting events. It mapped the various consumer participation and the ROI metrics. What is the return on investment metrics? And I was quite fascinated by the kind of reports which we produced. It had a huge opportunity by local organizations or corporates, so looking at going down below the line or penetrating their marketing or corporate spend from the tier 2, tier 3 locations to a larger cross section in the country. That is what sports offers you. It offers you a vehicle to connect with your consumer, offers you a vehicle to go as deep as possible within a geography, and offers you a long-term relationship. Moment these two things are running parallelly, I think the investment on sports will only explode. by corporates for their from a business growth point of view, as well as a CSR investment, because it's education at the end of the day, not really an indulgence, so to say.
Right. So, to kind of bring this conversation to a close, Deep, we've been talking so far about how private sector should ideally find a way to take initiative in terms of bringing them together. Assuming let's say we start living in an utopian world, what are two things that should change or evolve in the current sporting ecosystem for private sectors to be more open towards spending money on sport or investing in sport?
I think one, and I've been saying it again and again, I can say for the next 1 hour again, is that sport should become a part of the education system very, very clearly, because then you are actually making it inclusive. You're actually allowing every child to participate and grow there, or else not to grow there. It becomes a habit formation in the long run. It becomes a tool, a unifier for the whole society and the family. I think these are some of the things which go along with the education piece. The second piece really is, and I said it earlier, the reason sports as a culture in the US for a moment. Let me give you some data point again. The youth sports opportunity in the US is about $18 billion. To my mind, India with about 2 million schools, with 300 or 400 million children within the age of 20, is an opportunity as big, if not bigger. And that is something which private sector has to start see now. I think they have already begun to see it now, just that it has to formulate as a movement in days to come. For the sports consumption to grow up in the country, education and an opportunity to proliferate in the grassroots level in the country for a business of sports are the two things which will make sports grow in this country massively.
Right.
And I think that's the opportunity which we should clearly see in the next 5 to 10 years time. Sports today is about $2.5 billion industry, Indian context, okay? Easily envisaged to be $15 billion in the next 5 to 6 years time frame. So that's the kind of quantum growth we're talking about.
Right.
And it can only be a multiplication factor further multiplication factor if there are unifiers which bring the education, the grassroots participation into onto the equation of sports growth.
Got it. Thank you so much for your time, Deep. I think that was very insightful. I definitely believe that we'll obviously, I hope this is not the last time that you come on the show. As CII and Making India Play evolves and grows, we'd love to have you again on the show just to kind of talk about what are some of the changes that are constantly happening, what are some of the evolutions that what is some of the evolution that is happening, and definitely maybe offline we could talk about some guests because one thing I remember from our previous meeting is that because of your travel, you get to meet very interesting people during the course of your work. So maybe offline you can share some names of guests that we could call on the show to talk about what they do and how they are making India a nation of sport. Thank you for your time, Deep.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.